Ndokbe, Professor of African Linguistics and Linguistics of the University of Buea. My question, of course, is to the keynote, but also to all of us sitting here. I will start with the comment. We started many years ago with the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, in 2000. After 15 years, we moved to the SDGs, and we have SDG 2030. So we are barely 11 years from 2030. We have, on the other side, the British Council. We have SIL International. We have UNICEF. We have the UNESCO. We have LDC, Language and Development Conference, etc., etc. So a lot of money and energy is being mobilized to solve the problem of education all over the world. Yet, this morning we hear that 258 million children are still out of school. So what is the problem? Where are we going wrong? People have been deploying energy, money to do research, yet it seems we are not moving the way we are supposed to move.
So can I ask you to get to your question?
Yes, my question is, what are we doing wrong? Is it possible that by the year 2030, this number reduces? Because there are countries, when you look at those countries with those numbers, they are mainly in Africa and maybe Asia. In Europe, the numbers are lower. So what are they doing to have their number low that we in Africa were not doing? I think these are some of the questions we need to address seriously.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, a very great question to start with. Professor Graham, would you like to kick off with that one? Or? Okay, great. Do we have any more questions from the floor? We have one on Twitter that I can ask while colleagues are collecting their thoughts. So the question that we had on Twitter was, when you have over 100 ethnic languages in a small and low-income country, what is the risk of MTB-MLE raising more challenges than solutions? Okay, you wanted a provocative question? Yep, okay. And perhaps one more question from the floor? Yes, thank you very much. Go ahead.
Okay, Jimmy Almond from Mauritius, Deputy Director of Catholic Education and also independent researcher. My question is about the explanation given on multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. This slide was very interesting for me. I would like to know, how do we put in knowledge from people? We talk about interdisciplinarity among academics, but how do you bring in, does it just plug in, or right at the beginning we take stock, we bring in the people, their knowledge?
Great, thank you very much. 3 great questions to start with.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, let me take them in the order in which they were asked. In the case of you mentioned the likelihood or unlikelihood of achieving the SDGs in 11 years. I think we have to think gradually, i.e., not the 258 million children, I suppose, will in 11 years, or whichever number applies at that time, I don't think all of them will have access to mother tongue education or mother tongue based education. I think it is important, however, to move in that direction. What we are doing wrong is, even if we do everything right, it takes time. Even if you put a lot of money into it, you need to, as one of my colleagues whom you might know, Professor Zwogbo, who's from the Ivory Coast, Professor Zwogbo says what is really important is to equip languages. So some languages, like in southeastern Nigeria, have been, quote-unquote, equipped to serve a greater range of educational functions, and it is an investment that needs to be made progressively, which is why I think the Horizon 2030 is probably a bit, we need to set timelines and goals, but I think 2030 is probably a bit over-optimistic. But simply, I think what we could certainly do better is in equipping languages for this purpose and making sure that there is a setup, a broader institutional setup into which these languages are sort of drawn in so that the investment in equipping those languages for those functions is made. I think this largely, well, to some extent, answers the second question that has been asked regarding the situation where a low-income country has to deal with 100 ethnic languages. Absolutely. Now, in this case, what I suggest is to exploit two things. One is the notion of intercomprehension, which are only beginning to, I mean, even if the European Union has financed research into this already a quarter of a century ago, it has had little effect, but the results are there, and it works. I.e., it means developing, exploiting the similarities between mutually or closely related languages. The similarities, for example, to take examples that I'm familiar with, between Italian and French, or between Portuguese and French, or between Swedish and Norwegian. If you bank on those familiarities, you can probably make your investment a bit more cost effective. You can provide materials that are in either one version which is closely approximates the variants used by several other groups. You can, as has been done in the Basque Country, as has been done for the fourth national language of my country, Romansh, which has 5 different written standards, including one written standard used by 1,500 people, which was only coined in the 1920s. There was no written standard before then for this variant. Now, in addition to the 5 written standards, we have one common standard, which is used in those cases where the absence of any standard would have entailed the absence of this language altogether. Right? So if you use the same technique, you can, well, again, you cannot equip every single language, or it will take a lot of time, but you can equip languages that will provide kind of stellar points within your language constellation so that you increase, I mean, quite substantially, the proportion of young people who get access to language resources, educational resources, in the language that they hear in the home, or in something which is very close to it, so that they can experience what they have at school and what they have in the home as closely interconnected variants of the same thing, so that they are included and they are on board. I'm not saying this is an answer to everything, but this is an answer that can solve, I think, quite pragmatically, a large range of problems. Now, thank you very much to our colleague from Mauritius for this question about the feedback of knowledge from the communities. I guess it very much depends on the nature of the problem you're dealing with. In some cases, I would think it is, again, pragmatic to start out with something relatively top-down, in which you come up with propositions that can be true, false, correct, incorrect, but that are put on the table and to which people can react and provide their expertise in reaction to something that is not imposed but proposed. Now, in other situations, I would think that we can bank on much more bottom-up process, and this goes in particular for the development of educational materials. A few weeks ago, I was in the far north of Canada, in the territory of Nunavut, where the local language is actually, Inuktitut, is actually 3 different languages, 2 using their syllabary, 1 that uses an alphabet. And I've been able to look at some recently produced children's books, and these were definitely inspired by the local experience of what would be a culturally meaningful way to tell children's stories. So in terms of topics, in terms of illustrations, and in terms of the morale of the story. So in this case, I think you can have much more bottom-up contribution.
Thank you very much. I think we just have time for one more question, and I can see Chedda from the Philippines waiting patiently. Could you keep your question very brief?
Yeah. Thank you for that very enriching talk, and we appreciate the meta-analysis and the mention of ethical concerns in multilingualism. My concern is about identification, because language groups do not just move, they also intermarry. And so we have children coming from different language groups. And so my question is, how do you make sense of such hybrid identities? Should they, does the lingua franca or national language would be useful in this particular instance? How about, sometimes we tell them, you should choose your heritage language, or we would talk about the value of, introducing heritage language. So, how do you make sense of this?
Well, that's a particularly massive question, I'm afraid. Now, all right, let me start by saying that the role of lingua franca, and I wouldn't say lingua francas because there are several lingua francas. Historically, a lingua franca is a combination of the languages used by various interlocutors in regularly repeated interactions. An international language is not necessarily the same thing as a lingua franca. However, it may serve similar purposes. Right? Now, because we have, we think in terms of purposes, we can realize that we don't need one, but a collection of lingua francas which are going to be different depending on where you are, or depending on the groups of the community of practice that you're dealing with. So now, against this backdrop, the question you're asking is one that illustrates the point that I was making at the very beginning. We are having to confront increasing layers of complexity, and intermarriage with people from different language groups is something that is a very good example of this increasing complexity, because it happens a lot more often now than it would have a long time ago. Now, in this case, I would say, well, we should prioritize. This is where the notion of inclusion is important. It is important to think in terms of the place where the children that you're referring to, children from, for example, bilingual couple, right, with two different languages spoken by the father and mother respectively. In this case, I think it's important for the child to have in his or her repertoire something that, as we said before, combines something that he has in the home and something that he has in the school and the community. But if we're thinking about a situation where there are two different languages in the home, and then an additional one in the community, I think the language of the community is particularly important, but this could be in combination with at least one of the languages that the child gets at home. It, of course, takes on a different meaning in the context of internal, intra-country versus international migration, and this would lead us to suggest very different responses for those various situations. Again, each case is a special case, and I would not want to contradict myself by providing you a generic answer for what is an extremely a problem that will look very specific depending on where we are in the world. So I'd say I would like to conclude on a more general thing. When you have arbitration problems like this to make, because essentially what you're asking is an arbitration problem, I think we can go back on a rule in political theory, which is due to a very, very famous thinker called John Rawls, who worked on the principles of justice. And Rawls said that, one of the criteria for deciding whether a particular measure is good or not is whether or not it is in the interest of the weaker components involved. I think we can do the same general, that's one of the very few relatively general rules that I'm comfortable going back to, because again, each case is a special case. When we have to arbitrate between languages, generally the priority should go to the relatively more threatened, relatively less solid component or element among those in presence.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Graham, for your opening keynote this morning. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Professor Graham will be with us. for the 3 days. So do try and grab him if you have a burning question that you didn't manage to ask. Thank you again. If I could ask our colleagues, I think you have a couple of announcements before we move up to stage.
Thank you very much, Professor François Grong and Alison Barrett. So we'd like to do some announcement, a number of changes and cancellations that have occurred to the program, and these are not represented in the printed program. So you can find the most up-to-date program online, which does reflect these changes. Additionally, this information was sent out to all participants in an email Monday evening. And please note, the following presentations have been cancelled. The title, Language, Reconciliation and Social Cohesion in Nigeria, is cancelled. The following presentations have been rescheduled. The topic is Community Perspectives on MLE in Multilingual City. Today, which will now be during the first day of the conference. The presentation was previously scheduled for the third day. And the influence of regional language, essence lost while communicating, has been rescheduled for the first day. It was originally scheduled for the second day of the conference.
Additionally, we have a brief announcement for a call for questions, concerns, and comments. Participants are welcome and encouraged to submit any questions, comments, or concerns they may have after listening to panels and presentations throughout the conference. If you are interested in sharing your thoughts, you can access the forum by visiting the following website, tinyurl.com/IMMLE19QA. Selected questions will be then addressed by a panel of experts during the final plenary session.
Okay,
and
so
do we have a QR code?
Okay, here.
So here you can see the QR code to access the site. This is a great and simple way to share your questions, so please do not hesitate to use this resource. There will be additional reminders and instructions on how to submit your questions throughout the conference.
Okay, before we start the next session, we will have a 15-minute coffee break at the foyer, and we will resume at the first parallel session, which is divided into different rooms. So basically in this room, which is a ballroom, but it will be divided into ballroom A, B, and C. Okay, for those who are interested in listening to the sessions in this room. And also, please, all the sessions will start at 11 a.m. sharp. In each room, please also bring your belongings with you. After parallel session, there will be lunch at Amari restaurant on the first floor. Please wear a name badge. Okay, this is really, really important. And
also, there will be students filming and asking the speakers for short interviews for their social media content during coffee break and lunchtime. These students have recently graduated and joined the British Council Future News Worldwide program. They're very passionate, so we hope you show some interest.
So enjoy the morning refreshment, and please be reminded to share your ideas and thoughts on social media with #IMMLE19. Have a good morning.